Amidst the chaos of a devastating California wildfire, a stray dog named Shadow emerges as an unlikely hero. When a group of children becomes separated from their families during a frantic evacuation, Shadow steps in, guiding them through perilous terrain, warding off wild animals, and finding paths to safety. His unwavering loyalty and sharp instincts inspire trust and hope, leading the children to rescue just in time. Shadow's bravery doesn't go unnoticed. The Miller family, who were among those he saved, adopt him, giving the once lonely stray a loving home. His story spreads across the community and beyond, becoming a symbol of courage and resilience. The town honors Shadow, and his actions inspire fundraising efforts to aid wildfire victims and support animal shelters. Through Shadow's journey, the story celebrates the unbreakable bond between humans and animals, showing how even the smallest acts of courage can make a profound difference. What do you think of Shadow's heroic journey? Do you believe animals can sense and protect us in times of danger? Let us know where you're watching from and share your thoughts in the comments below. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to DG Story for more inspiring tales like this. Hit the notification bell so you won't miss our next unforgettable story. The air in the California forest was thick with tension as smoke began to drift through the treetops. Shadow, a sleek black stray dog, lay under a cluster of bushes near a clearing, his sharp eyes watching the distant commotion. He had lived in this forest for years, surviving on scraps left by campers and his own hunting skills. The forest was his home, and every sound, every scent, was familiar until now. A faint crackling noise reached Shadow's ears, growing louder with each passing moment. His nose twitched, picking up the acrid smell of burning wood. He stood, his body tense, as the distant glow of flames flickered through the trees. Farther down the trail, a group of children stumbled through the underbrush, their faces streaked with soot and tears. There were 4 of them: Lucy, the eldest at 12 years old, her younger brother Tommy, who was just 6, and their friends Mia and Jake, aged 10 and 8. They had been part of a larger group evacuating the area, but in the chaos, they'd become separated from their families. "I don't know where we are," Lucy said, her voice trembling as she tried to sound brave for the others. Tommy clung to her arm, his small body shaking. "Are we going to find Mom and Dad?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Lucy knelt beside him, brushing soot from his cheek. "Of course we will," she said, forcing a smile. "We just need to keep moving." The children huddled together, the growing roar of the wildfire pressing them to move forward, but with no clear direction. Every step felt like a gamble. From his vantage point, Shadow watched the children with a mix of curiosity and caution. Their panicked movements and frightened cries stirred something deep within him, a protective instinct he hadn't felt in years. Slowly, Shadow emerged from the bushes, his black coat blending with the shadows cast by the fire's flickering light. He approached the children cautiously, his head low and his tail wagging slightly to show he meant no harm. "Look," Mia gasped, pointing at the dog. Jake stepped back, his eyes wide. "Is he going to attack us?" Lucy stared at Shadow, her instincts telling her he wasn't a threat. She stepped forward, her hand outstretched. "I don't think so," she said. Shadow sniffed the air, his amber eyes locking onto Lucy's. He moved closer, his steps careful and deliberate. When he reached her, he nuzzled her hand gently, as if to say, "Follow me." Lucy turned to the others. "I think he wants to help us," she said. Jake hesitated, glancing at the advancing glow of the wildfire. "Do we have a choice?" With Shadow leading the way, the children began their journey through the forest, their hope reignited by the unlikely guardian who had come to their aid. Shadow moved swiftly through the forest, his keen senses guiding the children along paths hidden beneath overgrown brush. The wildfire roared in the distance, its fiery glow casting long shadows across the trees. Lucy clutched Tommy's hand as they followed close behind, her heart pounding with every crackle of flames. "Are we going the right way?" Mia asked nervously, glancing over her shoulder. "I think so," Lucy replied, her voice steady despite her uncertainty. She looked at Shadow, who paused occasionally to sniff the air and check their surroundings. His confidence gave her hope. As they pressed on, the group came to a shallow creek. The water shimmered with ash, and the opposite bank was steep and slick with mud. Shadow paused at the edge, his nose twitching as he assessed the situation. "We have to cross," Lucy said, tightening her grip on Tommy's hand. "The fire's getting closer." Shadow stepped into the creek first, his paws splashing softly as he tested the depth. He turned back to the children and barked, urging them to follow. Mia and Jake went next, carefully navigating the slippery stones. Lucy lifted Tommy onto her back, wading into the cold water. The current wasn't strong, but the uneven rocks made the crossing treacherous. Halfway across, Tommy let out a frightened yelp as Lucy stumbled. Shadow was at her side in an instant, nudging her forward with his head. "Thanks, boy," Lucy said, regaining her balance and continuing to the other side. Once they reached the opposite bank, the group collapsed onto the ground, their breaths heavy. Tommy clung to Lucy, his face buried in her shoulder. "I'm scared," he whispered. Lucy hugged him tightly. "I know, Tommy, but we're going to be okay. Shadow's helping us." The dog padded over to Tommy, nuzzling the boy gently. Tommy smiled faintly, reaching out to pet Shadow's head. "He's like a guardian angel," Mia said softly, her eyes reflecting the flickering light of the fire. Jake nodded. "I've never seen a dog like him. It's like he knows exactly what we need." As they continued their journey, the children began to trust Shadow more with each passing moment. He led them through dense underbrush, barking softly to warn them of fallen branches or unstable ground. At one point, Shadow stopped suddenly, his ears swiveling. He let out a low growl, his body tense. Lucy froze, her heart racing. "What is it?" The group fell silent, and for a moment, the only sound was the distant crackle of flames. Then, through the smoky haze, the faint rustling of underbrush reached their ears. "Something's coming," Jake whispered, clutching Mia's arm. Shadow stood his ground, ready to protect the children from whatever lay ahead. The rustling grew louder, and Shadow's growl deepened. Lucy held her breath, her arms tightening around Tommy as they all stared into the smoky darkness. Then, out of the haze, a startled deer burst through the underbrush, its wide eyes reflecting the flickering firelight. "It's just a deer," Mia said with a relieved sigh, her shoulders slumping. But Shadow didn't relax. His body remained tense, his ears perked as he continued to scan the area. Lucy knelt beside him, her hand on his back. "What is it, boy? What do you hear?" Suddenly, another sound reached their ears, a low, guttural growl. This time, it wasn't from Shadow. Emerging from the shadows was a lone wolf, its lean body scarred and its yellow eyes fixed on the group. It must have been driven here by the wildfire, its desperation overriding any fear of humans. The children froze, their fear paralyzing them as the wolf stepped closer. Shadow stood between them and the predator, his stance firm and protective. He let out a warning bark, loud and sharp, his teeth bared. "Is it going to attack us?" Jake whispered, his voice trembling. "Stay behind me," Lucy said, trying to sound brave as she pushed Tommy further back. The wolf lunged suddenly, but Shadow was faster. He charged at the predator, colliding with it in a flurry of snarls and snapping jaws. The two animals tumbled to the ground, each fighting fiercely. The children watched in horror as the fight unfolded. Shadow's growls were low and fierce, his teeth sinking into the wolf's shoulder. The wolf retaliated, snapping at Shadow's legs. But the black dog's agility kept him just out of reach. "Should we do something?" Mia asked, her voice shaking. Lucy shook her head, her eyes glued to the fight. "Shadow's protecting us. We have to trust him." With a final powerful lunge, Shadow knocked the wolf onto its side. The predator hesitated, its instincts telling it this fight wasn't worth the effort. With a snarl, it turned and bolted into the forest, disappearing into the smoky haze. Shadow stood panting, his sides heaving as he watched the wolf retreat. His black fur was ruffled, and a small scratch on his shoulder oozed blood, but he showed no signs of backing down. "Shadow!" Lucy cried, running to him. She knelt beside him, her hands gently touching his fur. "You're hurt." Shadow licked her hand, his tail wagging weakly. It was as if he was saying, "Don't worry, I'm fine." "He saved us," Jake said, his voice filled with awe. Mia nodded. "He's amazing." The group gathered around Shadow, their bond with the dog deepening even further. For the first time since they had been separated from their families, they felt a glimmer of hope. "Let's keep moving," Lucy said softly. "We'll follow Shadow. He'll get us out of here." Shadow barked once, then turned to lead the way, his body moving with determination despite his injury. The group moved cautiously through the forest, Shadow's steady presence guiding them. The aftermath of his encounter with the wolf left the children quieter, their trust in the stray dog now unshakable. The air grew thicker with smoke, and the children coughed as they pressed forward. Shadow stopped occasionally to sniff the ground, his instincts leading him to safer paths. Each time he barked softly, the children followed without hesitation. As they reached a steep slope, the ground beneath their feet shifted uneasily. The wildfire had destabilized the terrain, and patches of ash and loose dirt made the descent treacherous. Shadow moved ahead, his paws light and deliberate, testing each step. Lucy hesitated, glancing down at Tommy, who looked exhausted. "Are you okay, buddy?" she asked, brushing a hand through his soot-covered hair. Tommy nodded weakly. "I'm tired, but I can keep going." Jake looked at the slope and frowned. "What if the ground gives way? We don't have a choice," Lucy replied, her voice steady despite her own fears. "Shadow hasn't let us down yet. We'll follow him." As the group began their descent, the ground crumbled beneath Jake's feet. He yelped as he slid several feet down the slope, his hands scrambling for a hold. "Jake!" Mia screamed, rushing to the edge. Shadow reacted instantly. He bolted down the slope, his paws kicking up dust and debris as he reached Jake. The boy was clinging to a protruding root, his face pale with fear. Shadow grabbed the back of Jake's shirt with his teeth, pulling him up with surprising strength. With a final tug, he helped Jake regain his footing. The boy hugged Shadow tightly, tears streaming down his face. "Thank you," Jake whispered, his voice shaking. Lucy and Mia carefully made their way down to join them, their hearts pounding from the scare. Tommy clung to Lucy's back, his small arms wrapped tightly around her shoulders. "Are you okay?" Lucy asked Jake, her hand on his shoulder. Jake nodded. "I am now, thanks to Shadow." As the group reached the bottom of the slope, the forest opened up slightly, and the roar of the wildfire seemed more distant. Shadow barked softly, drawing their attention to a faint trail. It was narrow and overgrown but showed signs of leading towards safety. "Do you think this is the way out?" Mia asked. Lucy looked at Shadow, who stood at the trailhead, his tail wagging slightly as if encouraging them. "I trust him," she said. "Let's keep going." The group pressed on, their faith in Shadow giving them strength. For the first time, they felt as though they were making progress. Shadow glanced back at the children, his amber eyes gleaming in the dim light. He knew he still had a long way to go, but he wouldn't stop until they were safe. Shadow led the children deeper into the forest, the faint trail winding through charred underbrush and fallen trees. The wildfire's roar had diminished, but the smoke lingered heavily in the air, stinging their eyes and throats. Despite their exhaustion, the children followed Shadow with unwavering trust. "How much farther do you think we have to go?" Mia asked, her voice hoarse. Lucy glanced at Shadow, watching as he moved confidently ahead. "I don't know, but as long as we're with him, we'll be okay." Jake adjusted the straps of his backpack, his steps faltering slightly. "I just hope we find something soon. I'm not sure how much longer I can keep going." The group rounded a bend in the trail, and Shadow suddenly froze, his ears twitching. He let out a low growl, his body tensing. Lucy stopped abruptly, her heart racing. "What is it, Shadow?" she whispered. The children stood still, their breaths shallow as they listened. From the dense underbrush ahead came a rustling sound, followed by the faint snapping of twigs. Shadow stepped forward cautiously, his growl deepening. Out of the smoke appeared a small group of wild boars, their tusks glinting faintly in the dim light. They had been driven from their usual territory by the fire and now wandered aimlessly, their movements erratic and aggressive. Lucy's grip on Tommy tightened as she whispered, "Stay behind me." Shadow positioned himself between the children and the boars, his stance protective. He barked loudly, his sharp, commanding tone startling the animals. The largest boar, however, stomped its hooves and let out a snort, lowering its head in a clear warning. Shadow barked again, baring his teeth as he lunged slightly forward. The standoff was tense, with neither side willing to back down. One of the smaller boars made a sudden charge, but Shadow was ready. He dodged quickly and nipped at its hind leg, causing it to retreat. The other boars hesitated, their movements uncertain. "Go, Shadow," Jake whispered, his hands clenched tightly at his sides. The largest boar snorted again, clearly frustrated. After a tense moment, it turned and began to retreat, leading the others back into the smoke. The children let out a collective sigh of relief as Shadow trotted back to them, his tail wagging slightly. "You scared them off," Mia said, her voice filled with admiration. Lucy knelt beside Shadow, running her hand through his fur. "You're amazing," she whispered. The encounter left the children shaken but more determined than ever. Shadow barked softly, encouraging them to keep moving. As they continued down the trail, the faint sound of rushing water reached their ears. Lucy's face lit up with hope. "A river," she exclaimed. "If we follow it, it might lead us to safety." Shadow seemed to agree, his pace quickening as he led them toward the sound. The sound of rushing water grew louder as Shadow led the children closer to the river. The trail became steeper, the ground slick with mud and ash. The children's exhaustion was evident, but the thought of finding water spurred them onward. Lucy glanced back at the others, her voice steady despite her own fatigue. "We're almost there, just a little further." Tommy nodded, his small hand clutching Lucy's tightly. "I can hear it," he said softly. When the group finally broke through the underbrush, they found themselves on the banks of a wide, shallow river. The water was murky from the ash, but it was moving swiftly, carrying debris downstream. "We made it," Jake said, his voice filled with relief. He dropped to his knees and splashed his face with water, the cool sensation a welcome reprieve from the heat. Mia followed suit, cupping her hands to take a sip. Lucy hesitated, her gaze shifting to Shadow. The dog stood at the edge of the river, his nose to the ground as he sniffed the air. His body was tense, his ears twitching. "Is something wrong?" Lucy asked, kneeling beside him. Shadow let out a low growl, his eyes fixed on the far bank. Across the river, a group of trees swayed unnaturally. It wasn't the wind, something was moving among them. The children froze as they saw the flickering light of flames catching on the underbrush. "The fire's spreading this way," Lucy said, her voice tight with fear. Shadow barked sharply and began moving along the riverbank, searching for a safe crossing point. The children quickly followed, their footsteps quickening as the fire's crackle grew louder. "Do you think it'll reach us?" Mia asked, her eyes wide. Lucy glanced at Shadow, who had stopped at a section of the river where the water was shallower. He barked once, as if signaling them to follow. "We have to cross now," Lucy said firmly. Shadows found a way. The group waded into the water, the coolness a stark contrast to the oppressive heat surrounding them. Lucy carried Tommy on her back while Jake and Mia held hands to steady each other. Shadow led the way, his movements deliberate as he tested the depth. The current was stronger than it appeared, pulling at their legs as they moved across. Shadow paused halfway, barking to encourage them. "Almost there," Lucy said through gritted teeth, her legs trembling from the effort. When they finally reached the other side, the children collapsed onto the grass, their breaths coming in ragged gasps. Shadow shook himself off, sending droplets of water flying, before turning to lick Tommy's cheek. "You're the best, Shadow," Tommy said with a tired smile. But their relief was short-lived. The fire was spreading faster than they had anticipated, and Shadow was already on the move, scouting ahead for their next path. The forest ahead was a mix of smoldering ash and charred trees, the aftermath of the wildfire's relentless advance. Shadow led the children carefully, his sharp senses alert to every sound and movement. The fire behind them had crossed the river, and the smell of smoke grew stronger with each passing minute. "We have to keep moving," Lucy said, her voice steady despite the fear gnawing at her. She looked down at Tommy, who clung tightly to her hand. "We'll be okay. Just stay close." As they followed Shadow along a narrow trail, the group came to an abrupt stop. A massive tree, burned at its base, had fallen across their path. Its branches were still smoldering, blocking their way forward. "What do we do now?" Jake asked, his face pale with worry. Shadow approached the fallen tree, sniffing around its edges. He barked once, then turned to the children, his gaze shifting toward a rocky slope to their right. "He wants us to go that way," Lucy said, pointing to the slope. Jake frowned. "But that looks dangerous." "We don't have a choice," Mia said, glancing back at the advancing smoke. "The fire's getting closer." The children began their ascent, the loose rocks and ash making every step precarious. Lucy helped Tommy as he struggled to climb, her arms aching from holding him steady. Shadow stayed close, moving ahead to scout the safest route. Halfway up, Jake slipped on a loose rock, his hands scraping against the ground as he tried to catch himself. "I can't do this," he said, his voice breaking. Shadow immediately returned to Jake's side, nudging him gently. The dog's quiet presence seemed to give Jake the courage he needed. He took a deep breath and continued climbing. At the top of the slope, the group paused to catch their breath. The fire's glow was visible below, but they had gained some distance from its relentless advance. Shadow stood at the edge, his ears swiveling as he listened intently. "Is it safe now?" Mia asked, her voice barely a whisper. Lucy shook her head. "Not yet, but we're doing okay, thanks to Shadow." As they continued along the ridge, the group spotted a faint light in the distance. It wasn't fire, it was a flickering beam, like a flashlight. "Do you see that?" Jake asked, his eyes widening. "It's a rescue team," Lucy exclaimed, her heart leaping with hope. Shadow barked excitedly and started running toward the light. The children followed, their exhaustion momentarily forgotten as they realized help might be closer than they dared to believe. "Come on," Lucy urged, holding Tommy tightly as they ran. Shadow's wagging tail was a beacon of hope, guiding them toward the promise of safety. The children raced toward the flickering beam of light, their steps uneven on the ashen ground. Shadow led the way, his barking growing more insistent as they drew closer. The faint glow ahead was their lifeline, a sign that rescue wasn't just a distant hope but within reach. As they neared the source of the light, a figure emerged through the smoky haze. A firefighter in a yellow uniform, his face streaked with soot, waved his arms. "Over here," he shouted, his voice cutting through the crackling of the fire. The group slowed as they approached, their exhaustion evident. Lucy held Tommy tightly, her voice trembling as she called out, "We're here. We need help." The firefighter knelt, his expression softening as he saw the children and the black dog leading them. "Are you all okay?" he asked, his eyes scanning them for injuries. Lucy nodded. "We're okay, but the fire is close. We have to get out of here." Shadow stood protectively between the firefighter and the children, his body tense but his eyes watchful. The man smiled faintly, extending a hand toward the dog. "And who's this hero?" "He saved us," Jake blurted out. "He's been leading us through the fire." The firefighter gave Shadow a pat on the head. "Good boy," he said softly. "You've done an amazing job." The firefighter radioed his team, alerting them to the children's location. "I've got a group of 4 kids and a dog near the ridge. We're heading to the extraction point now." He turned back to the group. "Follow me. It's not far, but we have to move quickly. The fire is closing in." The children fell in line behind the firefighter, with Shadow keeping pace at the front. Despite their exhaustion, the thought of safety so close gave them the strength to push forward. The path became steeper as they descended from the ridge. Loose rocks slid beneath their feet, and the heat from the fire pressed against their backs. Shadow barked occasionally, his voice urging them to keep moving. As they reached the base of the ridge, the roar of the wildfire grew deafening. The flames were visible now, consuming everything in their path. The firefighter glanced back, his expression tense. "We're almost there." Shadow suddenly stopped, his ears perking up as he sniffed the air. He barked sharply, then veered slightly off the path, leading the group toward a small clearing. The firefighter hesitated for a split second before following. "Stay close to him." When they entered the clearing, the children gasped in relief. Ahead of them was a rescue vehicle, its lights cutting through the smoke. Rescuers stood ready, waving them forward. "You did it, Shadow," Lucy cried, tears streaming down her face as she hugged the dog tightly. Shadow wagged his tail, his body finally relaxing as he realized they were safe. The rescue vehicle's flashing lights felt like a beacon of hope. But the children's journey was not over yet. The wildfire had accelerated, its flames roaring ever closer. The rescuers moved quickly, assessing the group. "We've got to load them up now," one of the rescuers said, glancing nervously at the encroaching flames. Shadow stood alert beside Lucy, his black coat dusted with ash. He nudged Tommy gently, as if urging him to stay calm. As the rescuers began guiding the children toward the vehicle, a new complication arose. The narrow road leading out of the clearing was blocked by a fallen tree, its trunk still smoldering. One of the rescuers cursed under his breath. "We'll have to cut through it, but that'll take time we don't have." Shadow barked sharply, turning to look at a small path winding through the woods. It was overgrown and treacherous, but it seemed to bypass the blocked road. Lucy knelt beside him, her hand resting on his back. "Do you think it's safe?" The lead rescuer hesitated before nodding. "If the dog knows the way, we'll follow him. We don't have a choice." Shadow took the lead once more, his movements purposeful as he guided the group down the alternate path. The forest around them crackled ominously, and the heat was almost unbearable. "Stay close," the rescuer shouted, his voice firm as he herded the group forward. The path was narrow, forcing the group to move single file. Loose branches and burning debris littered the ground, making every step a challenge. Shadow navigated it all with ease, pausing occasionally to check the group's progress. Tommy stumbled, his small legs unable to keep up. Lucy scooped him up, her arms trembling from the effort. "We're almost there," she whispered, though she wasn't sure if it was true. Shadow barked encouragingly, his tail wagging briefly as if to reassure her. Just as the group reached a clearing, Shadow froze, his ears perked, and a low growl escaped his throat. The rescuers stopped, their eyes darting around nervously. "What is it now?" Jake asked, his voice filled with fear. The answer came quickly. From the shadows emerged another wild animal, a coyote this time, its lean frame hunched and its eyes gleaming with desperation. The coyote was likely as terrified as they were, driven toward them by the fire, but its unpredictability made it dangerous. Shadow stepped forward, placing himself firmly between the group and the threat. "Stay back," the lead rescuer warned the children. He gripped a sturdy branch, ready to intervene if necessary. Shadow didn't wait. With a fierce bark, he lunged at the coyote, driving it back into the underbrush. His growls echoed through the forest, a reminder of his unwavering determination to protect his newfound family. The coyote retreated, its yellow eyes glaring before it disappeared into the smoky underbrush. Shadow stood his ground, his chest heaving as he watched for any sign of the animal returning. When the forest fell silent again, he turned back to the group, his tail wagging briefly to signal it was safe to continue. "You scared it off," Mia exclaimed, her voice trembling with relief. Lucy knelt beside Shadow, her hand gently stroking his fur. "You're amazing," she said softly. "Thank you." The lead rescuer nodded in agreement. "This dog's a fighter. Let's keep moving before the fire catches up." The group pressed on, the narrow path winding through increasingly unstable terrain. Embers floated down like fiery snowflakes, and the heat intensified with every step. The fire roared behind them, a constant reminder of the danger they were in. Shadow moved quickly but carefully, pausing frequently to ensure the path was safe. The rescuers followed his lead, their trust in the dog growing with each passing moment. "We're running out of time," one rescuer muttered, glancing over his shoulder at the flames licking at the tops of the trees. Shadow suddenly veered off the trail, barking sharply to get their attention. The group hesitated, unsure of his intentions. But Lucy didn't hesitate. "He knows what he's doing. We have to trust him." Shadow led them to a small creek, its cool water cutting through the scorched earth. The sight of it was a welcome relief, and the group paused to drink and gather their strength. "This should slow the fire down a little," the lead rescuer said, splashing water on his face. Shadow, however, didn't stop for long. He barked and looked toward the far side of the creek, where the forest opened into a wider path. Lucy wiped Tommy's face with her sleeve, her voice gentle. "Come on, buddy, we're so close now." The group crossed the creek, Shadow once again taking the lead. The path ahead was clearer, but the fire continued to loom in the distance, its glow casting eerie shadows across the trees. As they neared what they hoped was the end of their journey, a loud crack split the air. Shadow stopped abruptly, his ears swiveling. "What was that?" Jake asked, his voice filled with alarm. A massive tree, its trunk weakened by the fire, began to topple. The group scattered as it crashed down across the path, sparks flying in every direction. "We're trapped," Mia cried, staring at the smoldering obstacle. Shadow barked sharply, running along the fallen tree to find a way around. He stopped at a narrow gap between the branches, barking insistently. The rescuers hurried to clear the debris, their movements frantic as the fire crept closer. Shadow stayed by their side, guiding them through the chaos. The fallen tree smoldered dangerously, its branches crackling under the heat of the advancing flames. The rescuers worked quickly to clear a path, their tools striking against the charred wood with urgency. Shadow stayed close, his sharp barks keeping the group focused as the fire roared behind them. "Get ready to move as soon as we have an opening," the lead rescuer shouted, sweat dripping down his soot-streaked face. Lucy held Tommy tightly, her eyes darting between the rescuers and the encroaching fire. "We have to make it," she whispered, more to herself than anyone else. Finally, the rescuers cleared a narrow gap through the branches. Shadow was the first to move, darting through the opening and barking to signal that it was safe. "Go, go, go," the rescuer urged, helping the children through the gap one by one. Lucy carried Tommy, her legs trembling as she climbed over the charred debris. When they emerged on the other side, the group found themselves on a wider trail that sloped downward, the faint sound of vehicles in the distance. "We're close," the rescuer said, his voice filled with relief. "This trail leads straight to the main road." Shadow barked in agreement, his tail wagging briefly before he resumed his position at the front. The group moved quickly down the trail, their pace driven by the relentless heat pressing against their backs. The fire was dangerously close now, its glow illuminating the path ahead. Shadow stopped suddenly, his ears perking up as he sniffed the air. A low growl escaped his throat, and Lucy tensed. "What is it, Shadow?" From the underbrush, a small but fast-moving wall of flames burst forward, ignited by the wind shifting the fire's direction. The flames licked at the edge of the trail, cutting off their path forward. "We need to go around," the lead rescuer shouted, his voice straining to rise above the roar of the fire. Shadow barked sharply, sprinting toward a narrow side path hidden by fallen branches. He paused briefly, looking back at the group with urgency in his eyes. "He's found another way," Lucy called, pointing toward Shadow. The group followed Shadow into the dense underbrush, the side path barely visible beneath the ash and debris. The terrain was rough, with tree roots and rocks jutting out at odd angles. Jake stumbled, his foot catching on a root, but Shadow was there instantly. The dog nudged him back to his feet, his amber eyes filled with determination. The group pressed on, their breaths coming in ragged gasps as the fire roared closer. The sound of engines grew louder, mingling with the crackling of flames. Shadow barked again, his pace quickening as he led them towards safety. "Almost there," the rescuer shouted, his voice filled with urgency. Shadow darted ahead, disappearing briefly into the smoke before reappearing at the edge of a clearing. Beyond it, the main road stretched out, lined with rescue vehicles and firefighters ready to help. The main road was just ahead, but the fire was closing in fast. Shadow stood at the edge of the clearing, barking sharply to urge the group forward. The children and rescuers stumbled out of the dense underbrush, their soot-covered faces lighting up at the sight of the rescue vehicles. "We're here," Mia cried, her voice breaking with relief. Rescue workers rushed toward them, guiding the group towards safety. The children were quickly wrapped in blankets and given water, their faces reflecting a mix of exhaustion and gratitude. As the rescuers began loading the children into vehicles, a loud crack echoed through the air. Shadow's ears perked up, and he turned sharply toward the forest. A large tree, weakened by the fire, was beginning to fall, its massive trunk aiming directly for the clearing. "Look out!" a firefighter yelled, waving his arms to warn the group. The rescuers scrambled to move the children, but Tommy tripped, falling to his knees in the middle of the clearing. Lucy screamed, trying to reach him, but the tree was falling too quickly. Shadow didn't hesitate. With a burst of speed, he raced toward Tommy, grabbing the boy's shirt collar with his teeth and dragging him out of harm's way just as the tree crashed to the ground. The impact sent a shockwave through the clearing, scattering ash and debris. When the dust settled, Shadow stood protectively over Tommy, his body tense but unharmed. "You saved him," Lucy cried, running to Shadow and throwing her arms around his neck. Tears streamed down her face as she held him tightly. "You're a hero." The group quickly regrouped, the rescuers working efficiently to load everyone into the vehicles. Lucy held Tommy's hand tightly, her other hand resting on Shadow's back. As the rescue vehicle pulled away from the clearing, the children stared out the windows, watching the fire rage in the distance. Despite the destruction, they felt a sense of hope and gratitude for having made it out alive. Shadow lay at Lucy's feet, his body finally relaxing as he let out a deep sigh. The journey had been long and dangerous, but he had fulfilled his purpose, protecting the children and leading them to safety. When the group arrived at the main evacuation center, news of Shadow's bravery spread quickly. Families and rescuers alike were amazed by the stray dog who had risked everything to save the children. The Millers, moved by Shadow's loyalty and courage, decided to adopt him. "He's more than a dog," Jack Miller said. "He's part of our family now." The story of Shadow's heroism became a symbol of hope for the entire community, reminding everyone of the extraordinary bond between humans and animals, even in the face of unimaginable danger. As Shadow lay in the Miller's home that night, surrounded by love and safety, he closed his eyes, knowing he had finally found a place to call home. The evacuation center was a hub of activity, with families reuniting, volunteers distributing supplies, and rescue workers coordinating efforts. Among the crowd, Shadow stood out, not just for his soot-streaked black coat, but for the admiration that followed him wherever he went. "He's the one," a firefighter said, pointing at Shadow. "That dog led those kids through the fire. He's a hero." Lucy, sitting on a blanket with Tommy beside her, overheard the conversation and smiled. "He really is," she said, stroking Shadow's head. Shadow leaned into her touch, his amber eyes soft as he basked in the love and attention. As the days passed, the Millers grew more attached to Shadow. Despite being a stray, Shadow adapted quickly to life with the family, as though he had always belonged with them. Lucy took it upon herself to care for him, brushing the soot from his fur and making sure he had plenty of food and water. "You deserve all of this and more," she whispered one evening as Shadow lay beside her. The evacuation center staff noticed the bond between the Millers and Shadow. One day, a volunteer approached Jack with a clipboard. "Are you planning to adopt him?" she asked, smiling warmly. Jack looked over at Lucy and Shadow, the dog's head resting on her lap. "Absolutely," he said. "We're not letting him go." The adoption process was swift, and soon Shadow was officially a part of the Miller family. News of Shadow's bravery continued to spread. A local reporter visited the evacuation center to document the events of the wildfire and was immediately drawn to Shadow's story. "This dog saved 4 kids and led them to safety?" the reporter asked, her eyes wide with amazement. Lucy nodded, her face lighting up as she recounted their journey. "He didn't just save us," she said. "He protected us. He fought off wild animals, found paths through the fire, and never gave up. He's the reason we're here." The reporter smiled, jotting down notes. "That's incredible. People need to hear about this." The article, titled "Guardian in the Inferno: The Dog Who Saved 4 Lives," was published a few days later, quickly went viral, drawing attention not only to Shadow's heroism but also to the importance of animals in times of crisis. Messages poured in from people who had read the article, many of them offering donations to support the Millers and the local rescue efforts. Some even shared stories of their own animals who had shown courage during difficult times. For the Millers, the recognition was humbling, but what mattered most was that they were safe, and that Shadow had found a place where he was loved and cherished. The days following Shadow's story going viral brought an outpouring of support from across the country. Animal rescue organizations and pet adoption advocates reached out, inspired by the tale of a stray dog risking his life to protect children. Shadow had become a symbol of loyalty, bravery, and the unbreakable bond between animals and humans. At the Miller household, life was slowly returning to normal. Their home, though marked by the wildfire's proximity, had been spared, and the family worked together to restore what little damage had been done. Shadow, now an official member of the family, followed them everywhere, always keeping a watchful eye. Lucy spent most of her time with Shadow, their bond deepening every day. She took him on long walks through the recovering forest, often stopping to let him sniff the trails and explore the underbrush. "You're not just a dog," she told him one afternoon as they sat on a hillside overlooking their home. "You're my best friend." Shadow wagged his tail, his head resting on Lucy's lap. He seemed to understand every word she said. Tommy, too, had grown attached to Shadow. The once shy boy often played fetch with him in the yard, his laughter echoing through the trees. Shadow's gentle nature made him the perfect companion, and Tommy's confidence blossomed under his protective presence. The local community decided to honor Shadow's heroism with a small ceremony. The town square was decorated with banners, and families gathered to celebrate not only Shadow but also the resilience of those who had survived the wildfire. When the Millers arrived with Shadow, the crowd erupted into cheers. Shadow seemed unfazed by the attention, his focus remaining on his family. The town mayor stepped forward, holding a medal engraved with the words, "For bravery and loyalty in the face of danger." "This medal," the mayor said, his voice carrying over the crowd, "is a symbol of gratitude for a dog whose courage saved lives. Shadow reminds us all of the extraordinary bond we share with animals and the incredible things they're capable of." As the medal was placed around Shadow's neck, Lucy knelt beside him, tears of pride glistening in her eyes. The crowd clapped and cheered, their admiration for Shadow palpable. The ceremony wasn't just about honoring Shadow. It was also about spreading a message of hope. The mayor encouraged families to adopt rescue animals and support local shelters, emphasizing the impact animals could have in times of crisis. Lucy stood before the crowd with Shadow by her side. "Shadow wasn't just our protector," she said. "He became our family, and I think he saved us in more ways than one." The crowd applauded, moved by her words. Shadow barked once, his tail wagging as though he, too, was grateful to be part of something bigger. Shadow's story continued to ripple outward, inspiring countless people. Social media posts about the hero dog of the California wildfire reached millions, with people sharing their own stories of how animals had touched their lives. The Miller family was overwhelmed by the letters. messages, and even small gifts that poured in from strangers moved by Shadow's bravery. Despite the attention, life for the Millers remained humble. They focused on healing and rebuilding, both physically and emotionally. Shadow, who had once roamed the forest alone, had become the heart of their home. One quiet afternoon, Lucy sat on the porch with Shadow at her feet. The forest around them, though scarred, was beginning to show signs of recovery. Green shoots peeked through the ash, and birdsong had returned to the air. "You're part of this family now," Lucy said, scratching Shadow behind the ears. "We're never letting you go." Shadow looked up at her, his amber eyes warm and full of trust. He rested his head on her knee, a silent acknowledgement of her words. Tommy joined them, holding a small drawing he had made. It depicted their family with Shadow standing proudly in the center, a medal around his neck. "This is for you, Shadow," Tommy said, holding the picture up for the dog to see. Shadow wagged his tail, leaning forward to sniff the paper. Lucy laughed. "I think he likes it." Shadow's influence extended beyond the Miller family. Inspired by his story, the town organized a fundraiser to support wildfire victims and local animal shelters. The event brought the community together, with people sharing stories of resilience and gratitude. The Miller family attended the event with Shadow, who quickly became the star of the day. Children lined up to pet him, and adults took photos, eager to meet the dog who had become a symbol of hope. Jack, holding a cup of coffee, watched as Shadow interacted with the crowd. "He's brought so much good to this town," he said to Sarah. Sarah nodded, her eyes following Tommy, who was proudly showing Shadow off to his friends. "I think he's done more than just save lives. He's reminded us all what it means to care for each other." As the years passed, Shadow remained a beloved member of the Miller family. His black coat turned gray with age, but his spirit never waned. Lucy, now a teenager, often reflected on the journey that had brought him into their lives. On one particularly clear evening, she sat with Shadow under the stars, the memories of that harrowing night still vivid in her mind. "You didn't just save us, Shadow," she whispered. "You taught us how to be brave." Shadow leaned against her, his steady presence as comforting as ever. For him, the journey was worth it. He had found his purpose, his family, and his home.